Hey, you guys, it's Kim. Welcome back to The Control Variable. So we might get in a little trouble today. Are you ready? We're going to look at two very loaded words on the show today. One is war, and the other is peace. And I want to explore these words with you guys because I was thinking about the war in Ukraine over the weekend. Like most of us, I was really excited to hear about the big gains that Ukraine made over Russia over the last few days. Thanks to serious financial and military aid from the US, Ukraine is now making major strides. They took back hundreds of square miles of territory from Russia this weekend. And that makes me really happy on a personal level, because I hate all the suffering I've seen the Russian army inflict on the Ukrainian people this year. But I also can't help wondering where this thing is going to end up. I mean, Russia's powerful. Do we really think Putin's just going to give up? I don't know about you, but every time I try to imagine Putin surrendering, I see that picture of him riding around bare-chested on a horse. You know that picture from 2009? I just have a hard time seeing that guy surrendering. And look, I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I hope all this ends with Ukraine winning back the land that's been stolen from them and Russia just kind of backing peacefully away. But I worry about Putin, whether he's capable of backing away peacefully. So all this talk about war and peace got me thinking about this guy I'm kind of fascinated with. His name is Craig McNamara, and he's the son of Robert McNamara, who, if you're not familiar, was Secretary of Defense under both JFK and Lyndon Johnson back in the 1960s. He's known as the architect of the Vietnam War, which means Robert McNamara was the guy who recommended sending 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam, more than 58,000 of whom would be killed in the line of duty, along with 3 million Vietnamese. No one is more closely associated with the Vietnam War than Robert McNamara. And yet, Robert McNamara was also a really loving dad. His son Craig adored him growing up. And at the same time, Craig hated what his father did in Vietnam. He participated in the anti-war protests and riots in Berkeley when he was in college. He spent years living off the land in Central America and South America, not talking to his dad. In some sense, Craig's been wrestling with the Vietnam War his whole life. So Craig recently wrote a book about his dad. It came out this summer. It's called Because Our Fathers Lied, a memoir of truth and family from Vietnam to today. It is an amazing book. So let's imagine this for a second, okay? You're a little kid growing up in the 1950s and 60s in Washington, D.C. Your family's really close, really loving, and your dad's your hero. He's tall and kind, brilliant. He makes regular visits to the White House, advises the president on big, important things like war and peace. He's even taken you to the White House to meet the president. You got to shake the president's hand, swim in the president's swimming pool. But slowly, as you're growing up, you start to have a bad feeling about this war your dad's involved with. While you're away at boarding school, your friends start saying it's terrible. They hold a teach-in about it. They say it's wrong, aggressive, that it can't be won. They have facts and figures, maps. They say your dad knows it can't be won, that he's sending American soldiers there anyway. And you don't believe the things they say at first. You call your dad, ask him to send you the real facts, so you can show your friends they're wrong. And your dad says he will, but the facts never arrive. And slowly it gets worse. When you're 17, you're with your family in Colorado for the summer. One day you come back from hiking in the mountains, and there are all these protesters gathered in a meadow outside your house. Your folks go inside, but you don't. You're curious. These long-haired protesters don't look dangerous. You want to hear what they have to say. So you listen, and the things they say make you sick. The thought of killing people who've never done anything to you. You know it's wrong. In your heart, you know. But it's your dad who's making this war. Your dad, who's never been anything but good and kind to you, is telling the president to send thousands of Americans to kill people who've never harmed them in any way. This has been Craig McNamara's struggle. And as a result, he spent most of his life thinking about war. What constitutes a necessary war? What doesn't? And his thinking has led him to live a really different life from his father's. For the last 40 years, he's been an organic walnut farmer in Northern California, along with his wife, Julie, and their kids. He's obsessed with sustainability and community, the idea of growing and tending to things, cultivating them. So I wanted to ask Craig about what he'd learned, being Robert McNamara's son, what spending his life thinking about war and about peace and questioning his father's choices has taught him, whether there was anything we might learn from him about how to build a better America in 2022. So here's my talk with Craig. First of all, I just want to say how excited I am to have you here on the show and how much I deeply admired your memoir and was incredibly moved by it. I just so appreciate your candor and the intelligence that you bring to some very, very profound questions about our country and about your dad.
Well, thank you. That really means a great deal to me. And interestingly enough, I didn't realize that my book and my memoir would resonate in the way that it has with people, Kim. Many of us who grew up in the 1960s and experienced firsthand the Vietnam War, I realized that it would touch memories for them. But really, it's gone beyond that because it is about our families. And each of us, your family, my family, and those who might be listening, have dynamics in their families that are challenging. And it's really a matter of how we listen and choose to change that in our own families. I think that's what I've learned.
Absolutely. What was wonderful is that because using the day, January 6th, as a way of sort of a lens through which to view our culture, American culture and society, I got to grapple with some of our sort of nation's deepest questions, which is something that you have done a lot of as well. And just really came to the conclusion that I think a lot of people are coming to, which is that America's foundational story is deeply dysfunctional and, in a sense, really broken. And what I love about your book is that you have had to grapple, I think, with the fallout in a very, very profound, lifelong way of the flaws in our story, and specifically when it comes to the legacy of violence in our American story.
I appreciate that. I mean, what you just said about our American story is broken and dysfunctional is tragic. And it is where we are today. And as a farmer, I bring to that story a whole nother aspect of our changed climate. And it's something that my wife and I are first generation organic walnut farmers. Maybe somewhere in our Irish heritage, we had potato farmers, back 400 years ago. But really, we came to this in our late 20s, early 30s, both having lived on the East Coast, coming to California. And today, we all are dealing with climate change. And the only grace and hope that I have for our family farm is the fact that two of our adult millennial children have come into the farm family with us and bringing their vision, their work ethic, and their hard work to try to help us pivot. We've been a successful organic farming operation for 40 years. And honestly, if we don't pivot, we will go under.
You participated in the protests against the Vietnam War in the late 60s when you were a student at Stanford.
Correct.
And you spent a lot of your young adulthood motorcycling through Central and South America, and also then learning subsistence farming and living very hand to mouth. At one point, you lived in a cave for several months, I think. And I wondered, in some ways, your life seems like a direct retort or reaction to your father's life. And I wonder if you see it that way.
I see it more in searching. I see it as the existential crisis that I think all of us as young people, as we're developing from our teens through our 20s to our 30s, that time of exploration is one of deep thought. It's one of where we're searching not only for our own identities, we're searching for what resonates, what we're passionate about to become a career. So yes, I definitely fell into that category of searching an existential crisis. And the overlay, as I've always said, was the Vietnam War. My entire adult life, actually pre-adult, from 1962 when I was 12 years old, all the way through my life, in one way or another, the decisions that I've made have been based on the thread of Vietnam. And my decision to drop out of college as a sophomore, to head to Latin America, actually to immerse myself into subsistence farming, all based on the war, of getting away from a country that I loved, which is our country, the United States of America, but one that I had lost connectivity with.
In your father's 1995 memoir, In Retrospect, he admitted that the decisions he and others in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations made about Vietnam were, quote, terribly wrong. But he never apologized. Why not?
Well, Kim, it's really interesting because my memoir was published on May 10th of this year. And subsequently, I have a binder behind me of emails, not just reviews, but emails, correspondence, letters, and it's very thick. And I've been getting many responses to exactly your question. And one that resonated with me is that my father was thought of as a numbers man. He was one of 10 whiz kids. He was a strategic planner, and he depended on those numbers as Secretary of Defense. And the war was not about numbers. The war was about culture, about feelings, about emotions, about civil war, way beyond numbers.
Right. Numbers are just a tool. They don't have ethics, numbers. They don't have morals.
No, he was using numbers as a matrix rather than understanding what Ho Chi Minh was all about. And it's so interesting. Emily, our youngest family member, and I traveled to Vietnam in November of 2017. It was a remarkable trip for both of us. And we spent 3 weeks. And in Hanoi, we met with the son of General Giap. Now, General Giap was hand selected by Ho Chi Minh to lead the military from the late 1950s through the Vietnam War. So he was the Vietnam counterpart to Robert McNamara. And when I met his son in the home that General Giap lived in Hanoi, of the many things that the son said to me, this is one. And I quote, I think that when my father, that would be General Giap, met your father, he said, quote, Americans didn't understand Vietnamese culture and history. And he was so right. That's not about numbers. That's about who a civilization is and what they want and the thousands of years that they've been in conflict. I guess we didn't care to understand that.
Yeah.
And that led to the demise of our side of the war and the impact that it had on the loss of maybe 2+ million people in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos.
Yeah, I mean, I was incredibly moved by that scene in the book with the two of you with you and Nam and Rose meeting, and it just felt so beautiful. I mean, I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit more about it and what it meant to you, because it's really moving.
Well, thank you for focusing on that because it was tremendously moving. The house itself was an old French-style villa that General Giap lived in, and I don't really know if Nam, his son, grew up in the house or not, but he and his wife Rose have been living there. And in the garden, which is a rose garden, so this was General Giap's rose garden, the trellising that held up the roses was constructed of bomb casings from bombs that we had dropped on Hanoi. Those casings were literally 2.5, 3 feet tall and welded together to hold up the casing.
It's so beautiful. I love that. It's so poetic.
The irony. And in the Vietnamese tradition and culture, when a person dies, typically a shrine is created for them. And in this case, right up some steps into the house was the shrine of General Giap. So that would be Nam's father. So Nam, his wife Rose, and I walked up the steps holding each other's hands and paid tribute to General Giap in this room where there were incense, daily fruits and flowers were taken. And it was a very moving time. And then we walked from there into the room, not attached to the house, where General Giap would meet with leaders from around the world. I imagine when my father went to Hanoi to meet with General Giap, which was also in 1995, he probably met the general in that room. And there were artifacts from different dignitaries, ambassadors, presidents, and leaders from all over the world, Ho Chi Minh included, who had been in that room. It was very moving. I wanted to just slow down. I live at a very rapid rate as my family, if they were here to tell you, I am a person of velocity and I need to slow down. And so I made a real mental note to myself. Craig, just listen and take in and slow down in this moment.
Yeah, I wondered if it brought a measure of peace or kind of closure to you.
It very much did. It was such a generous gesture, way beyond a gesture. It was an embrace that Nam and Rose extended to me, which actually then turned into an evening dinner that they invited us to. And I think, Kim, this is what I want those who have not been to Vietnam, those who fought in Vietnam, those who resisted Vietnam, I want us all to take a moment to realize that when you travel to Vietnam, you will be received in a very friendly way. The embrace that will be extended to you is something unlike any I've ever experienced in the world. And I want to quote a woman who heads up she's the director of the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. She's a Vietnamese woman whose name is Tran Hoan Thao. And this is a quote that I recently read of hers, and it goes like this. So she's referring to the Vietnamese. We don't forget the horrors of the war, but we forgive in order to move on. There is so much we can do together. End quote. I find that to be a remarkable approach to life, right? Hopefully you and I can do the same in our lives.
Absolutely. Well, yes, it's certainly what I am trying to do in my life. And it's very clearly what that's been sort of an operating principle for you in terms of your sort of eschewing of American individualism, of the American individualism that really seemed to define your father, and instead choosing to focus on working with a group, right? Like on teamwork and on lifting each other up and the joys of interdependence as opposed to the sort of the solitary independence that defined so much of American masculinity in the past. I mean, it seems pretty clear that you've really made a strong effort to live a life of interdependence with the people around you.
Well, thank you. Maybe what we're nibbling around is the issue of emotional intelligence, and as you have read in my memoir, it truly is a memoir of love. It's a love story, but a complicated love story. My mom and dad were amazing parents and introduced me to the wilderness and introduced me to land early on, and to, in their own way, my mom and dad had an amazing garden in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I remember my dad going out, picking a big ripe tomato and having a salt shaker and taking a big bite, and, just juice running down, and my mom picking peonies and artichokes. So those initial introductions to nature are why I'm a farmer today, I'm sure. And it would be improper for me to say that my father didn't access emotional intelligence, but in terms of the decisions made in Vietnam, I think he didn't use what he could have used.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gets Kim to another very important issue, and that is something that I think you've written about or you've spoken about, and that's generational trauma. And we all experience it in our lives. And the question is, what can we do to change that? What can I do as a parent of 3 adult millennial adults to change the generational trauma that I experienced? And, this is a word that I was not familiar with 10 years ago. And so why not admit that we have experienced trauma? I'm not a victim. I don't think of myself as a victim at all. But why don't we help our children to find peace in ways that we haven't?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there seems to be within the generation of your father, and I can see this somewhat in my parents as well. They're younger than your father, but in a way, like a terror of vulnerability, right? And
Yes.
and that terror of vulnerability is really kind of inextricably woven with traditional ideas of American masculinity, and so like it I think what I've experienced a lot in my life with my family, and I come from, my family's kind of like waspy American family like yours. I think there's a similar kind of cultural orientation which is really stiff upper lip, like really, I mean, my parents have really come a long way. They've now become these incredibly evolved, like 75 and 87-year-old. They're amazing. They like late in life, they really turned and they really changed their lives dramatically. But when I was growing up, we couldn't talk about hard things. We couldn't, everything was a glorious day, as you talk about in your memoir. And the idea of saying, like, I'm in trouble, I'm confused, I don't know what to do here. Like, I didn't have that language. And I don't blame them. The culture, right? I don't think anybody had that. Americans in that WASP culture didn't have language for this stuff. And it's because we didn't know how to deal with trauma, right?
Right. So really what you're talking about is tools that my parents' generation, and I'm just nibbling at the edge of your parents' age, if they're 75 and 80. So we're all learning together.
What do you think it would have meant to your father to apologize? What do you think that would have, where do you think the resistance to doing that came from? What would that have implied?
Well, that's so interesting. And it also raises the question of, if I had written this book while my father was alive, what would his reaction be to it? Because I think the two are very intertwined. I think he would be tremendously saddened by what he read here. I think it would begin the conversation that we never had, and therefore would be liberating for both of us, and therefore would begin the process of apologizing. Because when we've been wounded and hurt, when people have been killed, what do you want? What does the person who's lost a father, a son, or a daughter want? They want to be listened to. They want to be deeply apologized with. They want action to demonstrate that you made a mistake. That's what they want. And I think if he were alive today, or had I written this 20 years ago, I believe that would have begun the conversation. Not an easy one.
It's interesting because your hunger for that conversation is so woven so consistently throughout the book. And I mean, to the extent where, as I was reading it, I kept thinking, like, or I found myself thinking, and I wonder what you think about this, is I found myself thinking, like, I felt from your depiction of your father that he was absolutely unable to have a conscious conversation that would have included an apology, that was literally not possible for him. And I mean, you're his son, but I had the sense that, like, whatever those walls were, nothing was going to bring him down.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And, on this side of having written the memoir, I asked myself, why did you give up, Craig? Why did you? Yes, that firewall seemed impenetrable, but no firewall is truly impenetrable. Why did you give up? And I fault myself for that. I had access, so it wasn't an issue of access. It was just an issue of recognition that he was not going to veer from the path that he had chosen. And now I want to step into my father's thinking. Did he feel that he couldn't admit shame, that he couldn't admit to his son that he was dishonest or that he had erred, because he wanted to protect me from that? Going back to your parents and my parents, those are appendages of a time past. You and I don't embrace that. We try to be transparent.
What would you say was your aim in writing it? What did you hope to achieve or to accomplish? Was there a kind of transformation? Because writing a book certainly can be transformative. And I wondered if there was a certain transformation that you were hoping to achieve.
So I hope to achieve a grounding, a coming to terms with the decisions that my father made. And I think that quote that I gave you from the woman, the director of the War Remnants Museum in Vietnam, is where I've gotten to, Kim, which is, I believe that I can forgive my father, but I will never forget the tragedy that he participated in. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that as I began, but I made a specific effort while writing my book not to think about today, not to think about the interview that you and I are having today, not to think about sales of this book, marketing of this book. And I thought at one point that I wrote my book for my father. Well, that's partially true. I really wrote it for me, and then I realized that it has legs for other readers.
Do you feel like if you guys had been able to have more frank conversations about his heart and his decisions and his mistakes, that he might have also needed to say to you, like, I felt betrayed when you didn't testify in court in the trial where people who wanted to murder me were being tried, right? I mean, I certainly had that sense from.
And that gives me shivers down my spine, what you just said. And I think it's very appropriate. For the listeners who are not familiar with what we're talking about, it relates back to the trial of Wendy Yoshimura and the incident that occurred in 1971 when the Berkeley police found an apartment, a garage, right next to the UC Berkeley campus that was storing weapons, bombs, maps, etc., with detailed maps about attempting to kidnap my mother, my father, and myself, and bomb and burn the home, the vacation home that my mother and father had in Snowmass, Colorado. And eventually, Wendy Yoshimura was linked to this event because it was her boyfriend who was planning it. And she was eventually arrested along with Patty Hearst from the SLA in San Francisco. And when she came to trial, a family member needed to appear to identify that the plans, the map, and the descriptions were accurate of myself, my father, mother, and our home. And at that time in my life, which then would have been 1974 or 1975, I did not feel that I could do that. And that's a painful statement for me to make. And you've really touched upon something that I had not been put into words before. What did my father think that his son, who would not go to testify, not in behalf of my father, but to identify us and the property as accurate? We never spoke of that. And that is just indicative of so many things. We never spoke about the assassination attempts on his life, the attempt of throwing him over the Martha's Vineyard ferry on a dark night into the Atlantic Ocean, where he certainly would have been killed, the number of times that he faced death in Vietnam. Never talked about any of those. So he has every right to challenge me. He would have had every right to challenge me on that. And I wish we had those opportunities.
Sure. I mean, but again, going back to what you said earlier, I think really what we're talking about is a lack of tools, right?
Yeah.
It's weird, right? Like you guys simply didn't have the language to have these conversations.
Neither one of us. And the only time that we had any conversation was after a Mother Jones article was written. Mother Jones, which is an amazing magazine, came out to the farm, I'm thinking in the early 1980s. And I was quoted as saying something to the effect that all my father really, when he calls, all he really wants to know about is, how's the farm doing? What do you think the yields will be this year? What do you think the income will be? And that he never will engage in conversations about the past and about Vietnam. And I thought, my father doesn't know the magazine Mother Jones. He would never be reading it. Well, about 4 days after the article came out, I got this call from my father. And during that, he said, well, Craigie, I saw that article on Mother Jones. Is that really an accurate quote? And I thought, holy Toledo, how did my father, a friend of his must have showed him the article. And I said, yes, Dad, it's what I really feel. And he was quiet, and we never talked about it again. Which is just indicative of the loss that we experienced together.
I just think we got to do better. I just think mothers got to do better by their sons in terms of like equipping their sons with the tools to have these conversations and to sort of carve their way into these sort of unexplored territories of the male heart. And again, I think what's so interesting about your dad is that, you have these two very true parallel stories, right? Which is that you have a portrait of a man who authorized, architected, designed, and authorized horrendous things, and truly horrendous things. And at the same time, in this other way, consistently all throughout his life, he was profoundly devoted to his family and loyal to his family, and like very much guided by principles of what he believed were good. Errol Morris said, "We tend to focus on one part of people, the part we can identify with. But people don't have to be one thing." And I think that not only do people not have to be one thing, we're not one thing. Like anyone who pretends that they're one thing is not, they're lying.
Kim, that's very interesting because Arrow has become a very trusted friend. And by trusted, I mean he speaks the truth. And I consulted with him a long time ago during the writing of my memoir about this issue of evil. I don't tend to think of people as evil. There are a few that I can think of who I would call evil. And I mention them in my book. I won't mention them right now. But so the question of, and he said, I don't think of people as evil. Now, can a person be a war criminal? Yes. But he chose not to think of people, kind of going back to your quote there that you just read. He sees them in a fuller context, which I think is powerful. And I want to mention one thing. You raised the term loyalty. And when I spoke with my father about why he could not have come out earlier against the Vietnam War, he said loyalty. And I said, well, loyalty to whom? And he said, to the presidents that he served. Interestingly enough, after he was fired in February of 1968, a very interesting article came out in Life magazine. And as you recall, Life magazine, is like 18 inches by 12 inches. This article was 20 some odd pages. In the middle of it, this is a quote that my father gave to the person writing the article. Quote, "Around Washington, there is this concept of the higher loyalty. I think it's a heretical concept. This idea that there's a duty to serve the nation above the duty to serve the president, and that you're justified in doing so. It will destroy democracy if it's followed. You have to subordinate a part of yourself, a part of your views," end quote. And I now mention that he took the same oath of office that our men and women who serve in government today take. And it is, "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." It does not say, "I will swear my loyalty to the President of the United States." So I think I think he was wrong in solely being loyal to the presidents. Now you can go in and say, okay, Secretary of Defense, he sits between the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And during the Vietnam War, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to ramp up the war. They wanted to increase bombing. They were willing to use tactical nuclear weapons if China came into the fight. So, he was between a rock and a hard place, but he could have exited. He could have joined Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and resisted the war.
There's this other incredible story that you tell at the end of the book about getting stuck in a blizzard in the Alps with your dad and saying, "Dad, I really want to go home. Can we go home?" And he says, "No, I'm not going back, and neither are you." I felt those words like in the deepest place, like, oh, that his will is the core truth of this man's character, for better and worse, right? Like that iron will, that firewall you talk about, like that he was going to stick to his guns, as it were.
Yeah, you're a very perceptive reader, Kim, and that was a memorable time. I was at least 16 years old or 17 years old. I was not a kid. I was not a 12-year-old or whatever, and it was remarkable. It was a full-on whiteout blizzard. And I go on in that story to share another comment about when one of my sons and I were hiking and looking for my mom's ashes. Actually, tomorrow I'm leaving to go to Aspen, Colorado to do exactly the same thing, to hike up into the Snowmass Creek area to revisit my mom's grave. But this particular time, Sean and I had gotten there and it was still snowy. It was June, but it was a late snow. And we were trudging through the snow. There's no way we're going to find the place that I buried my mom. And finally, he said, I think this is dangerous and we should turn around. And it was the exact same moment. And I said, oh, you're right. This this is crazy. I am being crazy.
Craig, that is so profound. I feel like that is like the triumphant moment. Like that is like you learned the lesson, right? And you demonstrated a different kind of a role model that a father can be.
Well, you could also think of it, and I didn't, as defeat. I was defeated. In that moment, I had a goal, which was to return to visit my mom's, mountain ashes, and I was defeated. That's okay.
Well, that's the whole thing. Is like, we don't even have to put it in terms of defeat. It was never a war. You had a goal. Right. You had something you guys wanted to do. It turned out to be not feasible given the weather, right? So given that a variable changed, right? Like the weather got involved and you paid attention enough in the moment to think, oh, hang on, this isn't a good idea anymore. Or when your son said, hang on, this isn't a good idea anymore, you were conscious enough not to let some higher idea of bravery or heroism or whatever force you forward. And instead to think, oh, yeah, it would be a mistake to go forward. That's all, right? So do you feel like by the end of his life, do you feel like he deeply understood the lessons that he talks about in his memoir?
That's a very, very powerful question. I think he probably did understand them. And that is why, as he was dying, he said to me that he felt that God had abandoned him. And, that's a very emotional, powerful way to leave this earth. And I said to him that, Dad, I don't think that God has abandoned you. I think he's holding you in the palm of his hand and you can let go. And I realized post that time, was that the right thing to say? Should I have said, well, Dad, tell me what you mean by you feel that God has abandoned you? Would that have opened up the discussion that he and I never had? I don't know. I still believe that on death's doorstep, you want that person to pass with as much humility and peace as possible. So,
long before I really understood these words, there's a line from Toni Morrison's Beloved that lived in my head, and I didn't understand why it lived so powerfully in my head. There's an old Black woman who is free and who is at the end of her life, and she becomes kind of like the spiritual leader for this community of freed slaves in Ohio. And she has these sort of Sunday gatherings in the woods. And she has this incredible scene where she sort of calls in all the mothers and calls in all the children and is saying, like, just lay it all down, sword and shield. And for the longest time, I didn't understand why it meant so much to me. And then one day I tried it. Like one day when I was meditating, I thought, God, what would it feel like to lay it all down, like the sword and the shield? And it was like the most profound relief, right? It was like, that is surrender, right?
It's universal peace, right? Is it not?
And I sort of think that's what you were providing your dad with. I don't know if he accepted it or not, but you were certainly, from what you said, from your words, the idea that God was holding him in the palm of his hand. I mean, that's a position in which he could have surrendered. And ultimately in death, we do surrender, right?
I hope he passed in peace. I hoped many things for us. And by us, I mean my relationship with him. But I also had hoped that he would have revealed and been an active participant in his apology to the families, both in America and in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, who lost their loved ones, and then done something active, created an endowment, created a fund, created a credit system to address Agent Orange damage, to address napalm damage, to address the unexploded ordnance that still is blowing up people and children in Vietnam. Those are the, as a father, as a husband, a father, and a farmer, I think a lot about hope. And I realized that as a word, it's rather meaningless unless you put the action behind it that really makes hope an active word. And so when I think about my father, there are actions that I wish that he had taken.
So that was Craig McNamara. We're actually going to do a follow-up show with him next week because there was a lot more fascinating stuff that came out of our conversation. But for now, let me just say that I'm really moved by the way Craig has lived. Because as painful as Craig's life has been, he's ended up thinking deeply about some really important things, grappling with really hard questions. Like, is it ever okay to kill other people? Are there circumstances in which it is necessary to kill other people? And I like where Craig comes out in the whole thing. As a farmer, and not just a farmer, an educator too. He's actually founded this awesome thing called the Center for Land-Based Learning, which seeks to inspire, educate, and cultivate future generations of farmers, agricultural leaders, and natural resource stewards. So basically, they teach high school kids all this awesome stuff. They teach them how to restore natural habitats, they train them for careers in environmental science, and they teach them to develop and create solutions for local watersheds, which in California is pretty important these days. You might say Craig's a new kind of American patriot, one who shows his love of country by cultivating the land and caring for the community of people who cultivate it with him. A man who grows things, tends to things, instead of destroying them. Okay, that's our show for today. I'm Kim Cutter, and this is The Control Variable. See you next time. To donate to Craig's nonprofit, the Center for Land-Based Learning, go to www.landbasedlearning.org. www.landbasedlearning.org. And to donate to veterans of the Vietnam War, visit the Vietnam Veterans Association at vva.org. Guys, if you like the show, please be sure to go rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. And be honest, okay? Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like, what annoyed the hell out of you, what you want to hear more of. I'll listen, I promise. We're in this together, okay? Let's make something amazing. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Rowe Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The Control Variable is managed by Sean Madison. Fact-checking by Kelly Stakopoulos. Megan Pettit is our researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the Control Variable train on the tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.